You must tell me all your secrets. Remember, we must share everything together. Everything.
I know these rules can feel constraining, but remember, the point of this course is to learn how to write clearly and persuasively. Think about that. Think about the truth of your argument. You're an amazing person, Ellie. I couldn't ask for a more incredible daughter.
Are you actually trying to parent me right now?
Who would want me to be a part of their life?
You don't stay in touch with Mom?
She really only tells me things about you.
Why?
Because that's all I want to know about.
Why'd you gain all that weight?
Someone close to me passed away, and it had an effect on me.
You haven't seen her since she was 8 years old and you're gonna reconnect with her?
Sorry.
I don't like this. This isn't a good idea.
I'm sorry.
You say you're sorry one more time, I will shove a knife right into you, I swear to God.
Go ahead. What's it gonna do? My internal organs are 2 feet in at least.
Why do you suddenly need to see her so bad? Why now?
Liz. I'm worried that she's forgotten what an amazing person she is. I need to know that she's gonna have a decent life where she cares about people and that she's gonna be okay. I need to know that I have done one thing right with my life.
Hello again, this is Annie Rose Malamet, and you're listening to kind of new venture I'm doing where I do review episodes of new movies. So back in October, I did a review of the new Hellraiser movie and a review of Blonde, the Marilyn Monroe movie. And so far, the reviews have not been for movies that I enjoy. And that's kind of an accident. But with this one, I really, I knew that I wasn't going to like it. So the theme, I guess, for these reviews is like, I mean, I love a good, bad review. So the theme so far is kind of like my attempt at good, bad reviews. And I'm here today talking about the controversial new film, The Whale, directed by Darren Aronofsky. And I'm here today with fat liberationist academic Caleb Luna. Hi, Caleb.
Hi, I'm so excited to be here.
I'm so excited to have you. I feel like, you're the perfect person to talk about this film with.
I'm so honored. Thank you.
And can you tell the listeners, Caleb, who you are and what your work is about?
Sure. Like you said, I identify as an artist, an academic, a public scholar, a theorist of the body, and fat slut. So my academic work is on race, size, sexuality, disability, and media and culture. So kind of think critically about the way that fatness shows up in various media and cultural objects. And that includes by fat artists and actors, as well as by non-fat artists and actors, right? So the ways that internalized fat phobia or externalized fat phobia shows up through non-fat people, which is very clear in the example today with The Whale.
Caleb, we're talking specifically about The Whale today, but I guess I just wanted to gauge, how familiar are you with Darren Aronofsky's work, and do you like it?
Might be some some insight. I think I couldn't recall what movies he's done off the top of my head. I think he did Requiem for a Dream, right? Which
Requiem for a Dream, Black Swan,
oh god, okay.
Mother,
Never
exclamation
saw
point.
Mother.
I really, really dislike Mother. um, I don't think I like him. Think I should be more confident. I don't like Darren Aronofsky's work. He also did that movie, The Fountain, which like all of the very deep people in my college really liked. I find his work like pretty insulting and maudlin masquerading as prestige. And I think the only movie of his that I've seen that I thought was compelling in any way was Black Swan. And I had a bonus episode about it a couple years ago. But other than that, I'm not a fan. So I just want to, up front say that I'm biased. And this movie is possibly even worse than I even imagined.
Yeah.
And Caleb and I actually saw it together in theaters.
Which I'm so grateful for. It would have been so much worse to watch it alone.
Yeah, I'm really glad that we were together because as soon as the movie opened, so my TLDR summary of this film is that Brendan Fraser plays a reclusive, extremely fat, what people are referring to as morbidly obese English teacher named Charlie, who exists alone in this dank apartment, kind of mourning his partner's suicide. His partner's old room is completely untouched. And he is tended to by his best friend, Liz, played by Hong Chua. And he attempts to reconnect with his estranged daughter, played by Sadie Sink, and a wayward missionary. I forget the actor's name, to be honest with you. And during the last week of his life, quote unquote, last week of his life, you never really know if it is, dying of heart failure. And the movie opens immediately with Brendan Fraser in a gigantic fat suit jerking off to gay porn and having like a heart failure moment which will carry over through the rest of the film, and this is like supposedly the last week of his life. So if that summary didn't sell you, it's like just kind of miserable. It's based on a play, and I didn't read it, but Caleb did. So Caleb, can you tell me a little bit about the play?
Yeah. So I do another podcast called Unsolicited Fatties Talk Back, which has an obese cast. There's 5 hosts.
Hell
And we're
yeah.
all very fat.
Hell yeah.
But we did an episode about the movie before it came out. And there's 5 hosts, 3 of us read the play. And I was one of them. So that's my context for I mean, other than like the larger conversation on fat suits, which I said this to you in person, like I was so bored by it. I'm like, if you don't understand by now why fat suits are evil and violent and fucked up, then you just don't want to. Like, there's nothing more to say about it. So I did read the play, and the film is pretty true to the play. I think with for me, like what I feel like is foregrounded is that this is like a man who's grieving, right? Like the grief and depression that he's experiencing is not really taken seriously in either the play or the movie. Like it's kind of explained, but he's not thought about or approached as like a grieving character. He's thought about and approached as this like disgusting fat slob who can't get his shit together. Like I mean, I'm being very intentional with that language because that's how both of them kind of approach him. And yeah, it's just they're both pretty awful. I think um, the play is called The Whale. Um, it was written by a gay playwright who is not fat, Samuel D. Hunter, but who was like kind of fat, and he like wrote this as like his own personal horror story as to like where he could go. Um, which I think is a really important context and explains like some of why the fatness is presented the way that it is throughout the movie. I think the other interest, like I noticed immediately, like Brendan Fraser is not just watching gay porn. He's watching like two white muscle like jocks fucking, right? Like that's also really important, like the kind of gay porn that he is consuming. Um was really interesting to me. And I wonder if um like how much that was considered in that choice. Like if that was just like the obvious or like if the if Aronofsky thought that that was just like a kind of neutral generic kind of gay porn, which is very much not, but kind of gives an insight into the characters feelings about bodies and sex, right? As well as the director who didn't think like maybe like what if we found like fat gay porn, like how would that change um this experience.
Yeah, and Sam Hunter, like you said, he's a white cis gay man, and he had like a weight loss journey, right? Quote unquote weight loss journey.
Yeah, he is no longer, I mean, I don't know, like he was never very fat, but
He
he
was like
is
gay fat, like you said.
exactly.
Yeah.
But
I don't
yeah,
think there's like a couple of phrases that trigger my fight or flight response, like a sleeper cell, and weight loss journey is one of them.
yeah.
Yeah, I don't. Did it like win a lot of accolades? I got to assume it does.
It
It did, right?
did weirdly. I don't remember exactly what, but he like it was definitely like he won some sort of like fellowship on it to get, and then he was able to get it produced, and then it won some awards, and that was kind of his like um yeah, career as a playwright was really launched by this play, which is also like I think also indicative of the sort of cultural view of fatness. I think there's a way to tell this story of like a grieving fat person who's depressed that is a lot more generous and sympathetic and caring. And I don't think that that story would have gotten as highly praised as this one does.
Yeah, it probably would have been lambasted as like woke garbage or something.
Yeah.
Like whatever the terrible language is that reactionaries are using these days, but I yeah, I mean it premiered at Venice Film Festival to a 6-minute standing ovation. So this
Which is
is
just
this movie is getting praised.
it's so ironic. I mean, the 6 minute standing ovation is so interesting to me because it's also like I mean, there's so much about the play. Like they literally say in both the play and the movie that like the it's called The Whale because there's a sort of motif of Moby Dick. Brendan Fraser's character Charlie is a college writing instructor. And he was returning to this essay about Moby Dick, this terrible essay that we eventually find out was written by his daughter, and he like that's his sort of emotional attachment to it. But the the writing in the essay is kind of telling the audience how they're supposed to feel about this character. And it says in that essay that is repeated in the play and in the movie that like this book made me think about my own life, and essentially made me feel really bad for this person. But there's also in the film the daughter who is so terrible in both the film and the play. But
Extremely unlikable character, which I guess is supposed to be the point.
I think, yeah, I was thinking about it because you had asked that question of like, what function does she serve? And I think it's really like a misogynist gay man's like idea of what a teenage girl is, who, and kind of like a vehicle to express his own unfiltered fat phobia, because
Mm,
for some reason that is like, he
from the
thinks that
mouths
that's
of
like,
babes.
yeah.
Different
But
tenor coming from a kid.
yeah. Um, but there's that scene where she makes such a point for him to walk from the couch to the door without any mobility aid. And then when he's not unable to, we're supposed to think that it's like, we're supposed to pity him. We're supposed to think he's like disgusting, a failure. Again, like, I'm so glad that this isn't me. Right. So, and then that walk that he ultimately makes in the final scene is what is presumed to kill him, to push his heart over the edge. Right. So to go from a scene where you're like supposed to pity and discuss this character for being unable to walk what to them I would imagine is a short distance, and then stand up for 6 minutes and applaud, is again just like, it feels,
It's a little too on the nose.
yeah.
Yeah, for sure. That's exactly what I thought of when I read that, was like, wow, it's very strange that that is happening when a lot of the drama of this movie capitulates around the immobility of the character. There's some territory here that could have been mined that's very rich, like Moby Dick. I thought the motif of Moby Dick was going to be explored through the homoerotic, homosocial relationship in the book between Ishmael and Queequeg. It's a very, very famous early example of queer gay men's literature in American literature. And also with the idea of Captain Ahab being a disabled figure who is missing a leg and he has trouble walking. I thought that was going to be tied together with Brendan Fraser's character.
Oh my
And
god, you're giving Samuel D. Hunter so much
I'm
credit
giving him
here.
so much credit. I really thought that this was going to be woven in here. It's not mined at all.
No.
Instead, it becomes this with the missionary character, and also the fact that Charlie's partner who committed suicide because he was indoctrinated into this like evangelical Christian cult, which eventually, because they shunned him so badly, led to his death. There's this as a Christ narrative going on where Charlie Christ, I don't know, it's kind of obvious to me, like he becomes a stand-in for all the sins of the other characters around him, and is the ultimate martyr who eventually dies for all of their sins at the end. So, which is like pretty tired to me at this point in Western art. So, none of the interesting stuff is explored.
Yeah, no, I like, when the film ended, first of all, like, we all burst out laughing because it was just
Yeah.
so absurd. But I really think the people around us were crying.
They were
And I
like
was like,
sobbing, Caleb.
what the? It
Yeah.
was so bizarre. But I turned to you and I was just like, I never saw The Passion of the Christ, but it felt like The Passion of the Christ, of just like, I don't know, 90 minutes or 2 hours of just watching this person be like flagellated again and again and over, and this like extremely graphic and violent way, and it was just like relentless.
It was
Um,
punishing.
yeah.
It was completely relentless, like you said. Passion of the Christ 2 is apparently coming out soon. But
I
but yeah, it was a lot like that, where you're like, okay, when is this gonna end? Like, I at one point turned to my girlfriend Tashane, who also came with us, and I was like, are we gonna make it through this movie? Like, it was actually torturous.
yeah.
And, you know, maybe though in an alternate universe, we could have gotten something even worse, because James Corden was at one point set to star with Tom Ford directing.
Oh God.
Yeah, that would have been horrible.
Oh my
But
God.
Tom Ford left due to creative differences, and George Clooney also briefly considered directing, but ultimately declined. I'm so glad we didn't get those movies. I mean, the bar is low because this one's also really bad.
Yeah.
But the James Corden, Tom Ford, The Whale, I don't think the world ever needed.
No, I would imagine that there's this one like really gratuitous scene where Charlie is just like he eats like two large pizzas and then just like keeps eating just like these ridiculous. I don't even remember. I can't remember exactly what it was, but it was like a sandwich of like chips with like hot sauce powder or something. I don't know. It was just like so extreme and absurd and ridiculous. Um, and I just imagine like a Tom Ford version would be 2 hours of that.
Oh yeah, I mean, also like any of these fashion people like Tom Ford, like you don't want any of their hands on anything to do with fat people. Though I will say the opening scene of did you ever see Nocturnal Animals?
No, what is that?
It's a Tom Ford movie from a few years ago, and maybe eating my words a little bit because the opening scene of that has like beautiful slow motion montages of fat women, and it's
Oh,
actually really beautiful. Probably the best part of the movie for me. And the rest of it kind of has like nothing to do with that opening sequence because we see that that is actually an art piece in a gallery that the main character is working at. But it's very, very aesthetically beautiful. So, maybe it would have been better. I don't know. Maybe Tom Ford has like a soft spot for this topic or something. But that's definitely one of the most, even though it's such a short scene, that's like one of the most transgressive depictions of fatness I've ever seen in a film. So I gotta eat my words a little bit there. But like you were saying about the binge eating scenes, Aubrey Gordon, who is also known as your fat friend and is the co-host of the Maintenance Phase podcast, said on Twitter, it's so telling that so many only see fat people as humanized in media that shows us doing exactly what they expect, living short, small lives, eating ourselves to death, feeling sad and regretful, all reminders of how tragic it is to be fat and how superior it is to be thin.
I tweeted that this just feels like an insight into like the psyche of how thin people feel about fat people because that's like it feels less like a depiction of a fat life and more of how thin people imagine fat people to be their worst nightmare. And the thing that feels most authentic to me about the both the play and the movie um is the ways that, and I think I said this to you going in too, is like the thin people around him are so abusive to him, they're so violent that they're just cruel to him and mean to him and call it love, and that his that's kind of that's the standard that's been set for him, and that's what he sees as love, so much so that like he pushes them to admit to him that they find him disgusting, and then when they do, he is like, thank you for being honest. And like for him, like that is
It's like
um
pathetic.
yeah, and it's it's just really fucked up, but also I think telling of the ways that thin people treat the fat people in their lives, even if they think that they are doing well, even if they think they love these people, that there's a sort of undertone that I think a lot of thin people um agree with, that like if you love somebody, you tell them that like, that their lifestyle isn't healthy or whatever, that you would like express this out of concern. And I think the film and the play definitely take that approach. Um, and it just, yeah, it feels like the most authentic part of this movie, to the fat experience.
Yeah, absolutely. This, mass gaslighting and abuse positioned as love. But that's so Christian, right? This idea that
Mhm.
truth comes at the expense of love, that,
Mhm.
or the expense of kindness rather, and that truth is cruelty, which is love. Where actually the reality is like there's so many truths.
Mhm.
And in there's what's true for Charlie, there's what's true for the other characters, there's like the objective fact of what's happening. Like there's so many truths. And the one ultimate truth here that's held above all others is that like cruelty and debasement is the way through grief. And I just found that so insidious and fucked up, for lack of a better term.
Yeah, and I think, yeah, and there's a lot of, you know, studies and literature that shows that like people think that shame is the way to get fat people to change,
Right.
when actually shame like causes huge amounts of stress on the body, which um both like fucks with your metabolism and makes you want to eat to like regulate your nervous system, um and is not an effective motivator. um
Right. It's
in
never is. It
any
just keeps you stuck.
Yeah. But it continues to be like a prominent thought process, obviously, just so that then people can be cruel and mean to fat people in the name of this kind of kindness. um I think the other like Christian thing about it is like this idea of like life and longevity, which I always sort of uh scoff at. This idea that like a long life is innately good and innately desired, and that what makes a good life is a long life, right? And these very yeah, it's just not true, and it's not true to so many people's lives, especially people who are struggling with depression. um right, like especially people who, another thing that comes up that's very brief and is like skirted over is that Charlie has chronic pain, right? And so, like, when you factor in these things like chronic pain, chronic pain, depression, um, you're not necessarily wanting a long life to begin with. And that isn't necessarily a bad thing. But through this Christian lens, um, it's like the biggest, yeah, the goal.
Yeah, that's such a good point, and probably goes back to like Old Testament shit because all of those, you know, patriarchs lived to be like 500 years old, apparently, according to the Old Testament. But yeah, that's such a good point. I mean, when somebody dies young, the overarching sentiment is like, what a waste, right? Like
Yeah.
this person had so much potential, what a waste. Whereas like perhaps the tragedy of it could be positioned in less dismissive terms. And yeah, just this idea that like longevity is inherently good, or the Charlie, it's considered like extremely abject and like a sign that he's given up, that he's decided that it's okay for him to die.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean this is like uh it's making me think about how the story of my grandparents is that they died in their like 70s, like in quick succession, and that like my grandmother was just so heartbroken by the loss of my grandfather that she essentially gave up and died shortly after. which we is also the story here, right? That he is so grief struck by the loss of his lover that he has given up, but there's not any sympathy for that. It's not romantic because their age, because of how they both die, and also because they're queer a bit too. That even his like that he had to come to he came through his queerness he came to his queerness after he married and had a child and then started dating a male student of his. So even his like relationship um is a bit tainted. Like he doesn't even get to have like a a single queer life really, and exploration of his sexuality in that way. We don't know anything about the sex life of him and his partner at all either. Like there's just a lot.
The only thing we ever hear about Charlie with regards to sex is like him watching pornography, and his terrible daughter makes a joke at some point about like, yeah, I can't believe someone was able to find his dick or something. And that's the only thing we ever hear. I mean, there's also, I think this ties in well with my next point, because there's a lot of like demasculinization of the queer fat male body that coming up here, and I feel like that ties in really well with this. This is a vehicle for Brendan Fraser, right? Who's like having a comeback.
Yeah.
So Brendan Fraser was everywhere in the 90s, and he was a hunk. You know, he was in George of the Jungle. He was like an iconic hunky guy.
The Mummy.
The Mummy, yeah, exactly. And just like this ripped macho Hollywood guy, and he disappeared for a really long time. And you would see him on TV and stuff, but it was always like, where did that guy go? And then in 2018, this GQ profile came out called Whatever Happened to Brendan Fraser. And Fraser discussed years of suffering from injuries sustained from performing stunts during the filming of The Mummy, and subsequent surgeries, personal loss, a divorce. But the biggest thing that people focused on was that he shared his trauma of being allegedly, quote unquote, groped by Philip Burke, a former president of the Hollywood Foreign Press Association. And Burke told GQ that Fraser's account was a total fabrication. So Brendan Fraser is sexually harassed by another man. He's this hunky beefcake icon, becomes disabled and traumatized, and puts on weight, as you do, because that's a very natural human response to those conditions, and falls out of favor, and is now back playing a fat person. And Brendan Fraser is like one of those people where when people looked at him years later, they would be like, what happened? Like, he got fat. He's obviously nowhere near as fat as Charlie in The Whale, but he's like gay fat or Hollywood fat. So like crazy goalpost standard. And I feel that this is very strongly tied to this role. It's like the star power of Brendan Fraser is carrying this. And in fact, that's really the number one thing that's being discussed about this film. But there's also a mirroring going on, because Brendan Fraser gained all this weight from like the trauma and disability that he experienced, just like Charlie in The Whale. So there's like a strange mirroring going on there. Do you think anything about that?
Yeah, I mean, the other part is that he's also aging, right?
Yeah.
And that he's like, Hollywood aging is not like actual natural aging. And yeah, that there's, I think that is a lot of people's appeal to the movie, that we talked about, like how his performance is being very heralded, which is it is the best performance in the movie. I wouldn't call it a good performance. Like the other thing is that just like the film is so bad on every level,
Yeah.
right? Like all the acting is bad, all the writing is bad, staging is bad, costuming is
You're like,
bad.
well, this was clearly a play. It's one of those
Yeah.
movies where you're watching it and you're like, this should have stayed a play. You didn't
Yeah,
use the filmic form to say anything different about the story.
right. Um so yeah, it's just I don't know. It's also interesting that he is fat, but he put on a fat suit to become much fatter.
Hmm.
He also is not queer. And
He's not
so I mean,
queer, but he's like, he was sexually harassed by a man. So,
yeah,
like, in the public imagination, has become this sort of symbol of like queer interpersonal violence in Hollywood.
yeah, and the effeminization of
Hmm.
like being sexually assaulted by a man, that kind of mirrors the feminization of being fat as a man, as like a white cis man, especially presumably straight, right? There's all these like layers of emasculinization.
Yeah,
It's
absolutely.
the most heartbreaking thing for me really is that Sarah Michelle Gellar really loves this performance and this play. And I have to see I started following her on Instagram recently because I'm such a huge Buffy fan. Um, but obviously and she like I just keep having to see her praise for Brendan Fraser and this film, and I'm just like, Buffy, how can you do this to me?
I literally said on Twitter, like, I was joking, but I was mostly serious that this movie is 2 hours of Brendan Fraser screaming in a fat suit.
Yeah.
Like, it's just Brendan Fraser pigging out in a fat suit or trying to get off the couch in a fat suit and screaming.
And even the fat suit is weird. It's
It's bizarre.
like the way that the fat falls on the body is very unnatural.
Hmm.
As like a fat male assigned person myself, I'm just like you're like this is not how fat develops on male assigned bodies. It was again just another indicator of how far removed anyone on this film is from like the actual lived reality of fat people.
Yeah, it really, there's much being made of like, oh, Brendan Fraser wore these prosthetics that were like over 300 pounds. And like, isn't that amazing? And it's like, yeah, it looks like prosthetics, bro. Like,
Yeah,
he doesn't even have tits. Like,
exactly.
yeah, he would have tits. Like,
Yeah,
and there's like great pains made to show that he doesn't. Like
right.
showing him in the shower. I mean, it's just like so, and I say this as someone who like studies exploitation film. This movie is so exploitative.
Yeah. It feels like a snuff film. Like I've never seen a snuff film, but that's what I felt like I was watching.
Yeah, I mean, it just felt like literally just watching this person die for a week, and like, what am I
Yeah.
supposed to get out of that? And Nicholas Baer, who's an assistant professor of film studies at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands. I don't know anything about Professor
Whatever that
Baer.
means.
Yeah, I don't know anything about Professor Baer. But he says the whale is offering us an opportunity to recognize the virtue and the kind of fundamental decency of Brendan Fraser, who has been really wronged by the industry and has long suffered. I'm like, well, that's pretty optimistic. I feel like this is just playing off the suffering. Like
Yeah.
it's capitalizing on it.
Yeah. Somebody else reminded me on Twitter too that like Brendan Fraser has been in Doom Patrol for like 3 or 4 seasons now.
Mm.
Right? Like he's in this television show that I think is like a hit, is like widely acclaimed. I enjoy it. I think Brendan Fraser does a great job. He's like he plays like a robot character, so he's like again in another kind of suit. But it's just like for this to be framed as his comeback when he's been back is another like really interesting part of this.
Very telling.
Yeah.
I want to talk a little bit about the Roxane Gay review because she's such a prominent fat figure in our culture right now.
Yeah. Who like I mean, I was thinking about like, I am not a 600-pound person, but thinking about that's another part of this is that like his weight is so privileged as this like phantom number of like what that is supposed to indicate when we know that like thin people have no idea what weight looks
They
like on a
have
fat
no
body.
idea. I remember reading a book once, and the author was describing how a 200-pound woman couldn't fit in a car. I was like, they have absolutely no idea. Like, maybe you guys don't understand it, but like a lot of average straight sized people are 200 pounds.
Yeah. Um, and so just knowing that Brendan Fraser, I don't know how tall he is, but I know he's like taller than me. I imagine he's like 6 foot or taller. Anyway, I think Roxane Gay is particularly relevant because I feel like she has a body that is probably most similar to like the character that is um trying portrayed here, at least in terms of like height and potentially size. I have no idea how much
Yeah, and I
she
know
weighs.
I only know this because I've read Hunger that Roxane Gay talks about the number of her weight, and she weighs 500 something pounds. So you're correct in that she is closer to this body. Um and she can move and walk around.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the other part of it is like thin people don't understand like how fat you can actually get
Uh-huh.
before you like can't walk around anymore. Like there might be maybe some other issues like the chronic pain
Right.
issue that's going on. Um I loved Roxane Gay's review, but Caleb, you were saying that you didn't feel like it was scathing enough. I would love to hear about that.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know what I expected. I guess I expected more like cursing or something,
Yeah.
or just to be like how just extremely unacceptable and dehumanizing and violent this is. And I think she does say that. It's just in a much more
New York
measured tone.
Timesy
Yeah.
tone. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, maybe a little different than what we're doing here. um,
Yeah.
but I think one of the most egregious parts of this movie is like we're talking about the use of prosthetics in the fat suit. And Caleb, this is something that you and I study. And you said at the top of the show, if you don't understand why using a fat suit is so violent, like you're not going to get it at this point. But I guess I want to hear from you. What's wrong with the fat suit? And like specifically in film. I feel like that's a really huge question, but I would like to unpack that a little bit and talk about the fat suit because again, this isn't like an actually fat person playing this role. I think there is a difference in something like What's Eating Gilbert Grape, where the actress is actually fat. Um, there's something going on there that's a bit different. Although I would say I've kind of broken down the tropes that fat people fall under, and I just talked about this morning on BBC Radio 4 for the show Screenshot, which is coming out
Yeah.
on January 27th, so that'll come out after this actually. And I talked about how that movie and this movie fall under the subcategory of fat people as object of pity in films. So, yeah, I wanted to talk a little bit about fat suits, some of the most egregious examples, and why we hate them.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's so many reasons. I think for one, I think the biggest thing for me is that they continue to exclude fat people from visual culture and presence and life, right? And that they lean into this idea that like there's a skinny person waiting to burst out
Emerge.
inside of us,
Yeah,
right?
it's
And
like
that like
the actual, that's like the literal manifestation of that.
yeah, so that like fat people can never be on screen in any sort of authentic way, that we always have to be on screen filtered through some sort of character caricature written by a thin person, either as um, pity, scorn, disgust, comedy, right? I wrote one of the first essays I ever wrote was about the like ex fat character, right? Like classic Monica from Friends, who again was like a size 8 as a fat person.
Right.
But in that instance, like in the flashback sort of scenario, like I wrote about Monica from Friends and Schmidt from The New Girl, where like their lives are not able to begin until they have lost the weight, until the fatness is behind them. There's also the issue that it takes, in addition to arresting fat representation on screen at the level of like thin people's kaleidoscope idea of what a fat person is, it also takes roles away from fat actors, right? Like Guy Brandon was saying, I'm a fat gay person, I could have played like why.
Literally. Yeah.
And I think, like I was saying, like there's a way to tell the story with more sympathy and um care for the character, and without that sort of lived experience you don't get that. But the flip side of that, this movie also made me think about Precious, which I haven't
Yes.
seen in years, and I'm like, I don't know. It's hard. Like, and on the one hand, Precious gave us Gabourey Sidibe. Thankfully, she was well awarded and accoladed for her performance in that, as she should have been. But it also, I don't know, it just made me think back to that and my experience watching Precious and trying to like disentangle the distinction there, and like how much can a fat actor actually bring to these roles when they're written by non-fat people. I haven't researched Precious. Actually, I'm talking out of the side of my ass, so I don't know like how many fat people were involved in that.
Yeah. None of the people who made that movie are fat. I mean, except Gabourey Sidibe. And it's kind of, even though made by Black people, quite anti-Black.
Yeah,
Very much exploiting stereotypes to make a moral judgment or point, even though the whole idea is like it's not a judgment, but it so clearly is.
yeah,
So,
yeah.
again, I haven't seen it in a minute either.
My last encounter with it was I had a student who wrote a final paper over it. Um, a thin white student, and that was like, oh god,
That
that
sounds
was
rough.
very uncomfortable. Um,
Yeah. But there's something to be said here for, I mean, that's another example that I talk about in my lecture about fat women in film, which is called Big Punchline. And that she's also one of the figures of the object of pity that I talk about. But she's also an extension of these very racialized tropes, like the mammy figure, that has a really long and storied history. And of course, there's also a tradition in comedic Black cinema of the fat woman, the man in drag in the fat suit, which is like a mammy archetype, and it's also again this demasculinization of the fat man sort of that we're talking about. It also intersects with like visions of fat queerness, like Divine and in John Waters' films, but it's like so different than that because it's not an actual fat person, it's a thin person in a fat suit. And there's so much to say about those archetypes and those kinds of movies. And and I wanted to talk about what my girlfriend Tasha said about this, because we were talking about this movie yesterday, and she said this. She was like, "You should include this in your notes," and I was like, "You're absolutely right. This is a great point."
Yeah,
And
yeah.
she was saying that the Nutty Professor, or something like the Nutty Professor, it's a harmful, and it's harmful in its own ways, right? And it uses the fat suit, which is like not, we don't want that. But in some ways, it's almost less harmful than the whale, because there's at least depictions of Black joy and community with other fat people. And the main character is like loved by his fat family. Whereas in the whale, Charlie is like a burden. He's hated. He's reviled. Tasha says that she thinks this has a lot to do with the fact that a Black person is behind that movie. And, there's also this idea of like Julius, the Eddie Murphy character, is like a positive vision of masculinity, even though there's all these fat jokes. But it's when he becomes skinny that he becomes this like vapid, materialistic misogynist. And the fat version of him is positioned as like loving and respectful. And of course, there's the issue of like the fat jokes, which the movie completely hinges on. But there's also a different context here because of the culture of roasting and camaraderie in Black community. And this idea that like the roast like prepares you for the cruelties of the world. And I am by no means holding up this movie as a good film or a positive representation of fatness, but there is something to be said there for the difference between like the way white mainstream film has portrayed fatness versus the comedic approach in Black film sans Precious.
Yeah, and that's so wrapped up in, the ways that white supremacy has shaped our ideas of fatness as well as anti-Blackness, right? I think that comparison, or maybe not comparison, but like a parallel between the Nutty Professor is so interesting also because I haven't seen it in a really long time, but I remember like the parents are fat, like the whole family is fat, right? And so
Yes.
part of that love is also a familial love, a romantic love, whereas with um, fat phobia under white supremacy and anti-Blackness, part of the way that it operates is that it tells us that we can't be loved in these bodies in this way, and that's kind of what the whale perpetuates. Even though I think we see a flashback, or like we're shown a picture of Charlie with his ex, who and Charlie is fat, but not as fat as he is,
Right.
which again, I just think there's like a lot of interesting. I have so many questions about like Charlie and his relationship with his like East Asian like skinny lover. Like that's a story I'm interested in. That's something I like want to know more about, the racial dynamics and that the size dynamics, right? Like
I
I
was
have so many
getting
questions.
I was actually getting the impression that his lover Brian was also white, because Liz says she was adopted into
Oh,
this like white evangelical family. Otherwise, though, that would have been very interesting. But
yeah,
I think it's more like, she was adopted into this like sort of colonizing family.
that would make sense. But I don't know. It's just, again, I'm like, well, then why
Yeah.
make her I mean, yeah, there's just so much that is presented and not treated with care,
Mm-hmm.
not treated with kindness, not minded with any sort of value.
Love.
It's yeah,
Yeah,
it's just
it's abusive. Like the movie, it's like the people in the movie, the movie is abusing us.
yeah, it's just all refracted through this like white gay man's violent psyche.
You're right.
It's
Yeah. Yeah, it's like all his own like I don't know, anxieties.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really like a perfect illustration of how violently fatphobic cis white gay men are.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a huge problem in their community. And if you can call it a community, their culture, it's a huge, huge problem. And it's held up as fine art in this film.
Yeah.
Uh, there's also a really rich comparison between Charlie and Julius from The Nutty Professor and us
Mm.
as fat academics. I guess I just wanted to hear a little bit from you about what you felt about that part of The Whale.
Yeah.
About this idea of like, I mean, I think that there's this idea of like the fat man as like more soft and weak and feminine, and therefore like more prone to uh professions that require the use of the brain and not the body. There's also, of course, like that's what's been said about Jewish men as well. So there's a lot of history there with like anti-Semitism and homophobia. And I think we're also seeing that anti-fatness plays into this as well.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that was really interesting to me about this movie too is that like, and I will say this, but I will also preface this by saying I would be surprised if other fat people felt this way, that this is very much a me experience, right? But like there were all these ways that I identified with Charlie in terms of being a fat queer male academic who I taught college writing classes online in the pandemic. I had it, like said to you, it reminded me a lot of especially like a younger version of myself with a lot more internalized fat phobia, and the ways that yeah, I think I similarly like pushed people to call me disgusting in these ways and then was like, oh, thank you, finally you're being honest, when like that was completely unnecessary. um yeah, I mean, I think so one of the things that most struck me, I think that they kind of go out of their way to set this film before the pandemic,
Yes. It's set during
which
the Trump election,
yeah,
2016.
which is interesting to me because like now Zoom teaching is like not necessarily so um out of the box, or that's
I
not
know,
the
and it really doesn't translate in this movie because you're like, okay, so what? They're on Zoom.
right.
Yeah,
But
but
I
then
think
you
that they
remember it's
had,
2016.
yeah, I feel like they had to make that distinction to make his online teaching all that more abject and
Right, right.
pathetic, right?
Yeah.
And then even the way that it's filmed is that like his box is in the middle of the screen and he has his camera shut off. It's just a black screen. He doesn't even have like, he doesn't have a picture of himself. He doesn't have a picture of like a fucking dolphin or anything. There's just he's just like empty and blank and just like this black hole of despair, right? And then all of his students' cameras were on around him, which is the exact inverse of my experience teaching online.
The students' cameras are never on.
Yeah, I was often the only person with my camera on, being like, "Please, somebody help!" Um, but yeah, so there were these ways that I definitely identified with Charlie on certain levels, and I think again also as somebody with like chronic pain and like limited mobility, and I think that also gave me insight into just like how far removed um this depiction was from the reality of people like me, right? But to what you're saying about his profession, yeah, I mean, in Sabrina Strings' book Fearing the Black Body, where she does an incredible sort of overview of the development of the subtitle is The Racial Origins of Fat Phobia. She does a really amazing job of sort of detailing the development of fat phobia as anti-blackness. And I teach this book as like a history of whiteness and white people because she also does a really good job of detailing how thinness was developed as um, a white racial standard in response to the association of fatness with blackness, right? And so that's also wrapped up in this like sort of Enlightenment era um, presumption about the body and its as an exemplary of a subject's ability to be measured and controlled, and that there was this very strong movement in Europe in the 18th century that like a thin man is like a smart man, is like very tied up in masculinity and white masculinity, that a measured person has control over their senses and over their body, and that's indicated through their presentation of thinness. And as a current fat academic of color, like I still see that um, ideology resonating throughout the academy of like the academy is a very, very thin space. It's disproportionately thin, but because it's this like environment where it's a self-perpetuating narrative that they continue to exclude fat people from this what is imagined like upper echelon of society, and then treat the exclusion of fat people from these spaces as evidence that fat people are merely unfit to be there.
Right.
Which I think is true of also like, your local shopping mall and like every other aspect of society, but it's particularly egregious and relevant to me as a fat academic. Um, so yeah, I think that that is um present in the film. I think it's like his because he goes through such pains to teach online and not be seen. Um, which also just like as a pedagogical move, just like I can't imagine that being successful at all.
No.
And I mean, part of my work also is about like queer male sexuality and the way that fatness plays into that, and the ways that fat queer men are feminized through the fatness, especially if you're not like a bear, right? A bear is like the acceptable way to be fat as a gay man because the kind of hair that is required for the body hair patterns required to be accepted in the bear community, as well as the kind of fatness that bears have, is meant to offset the sort of objectifying feminization of fatness, right? Like bears have, like, I have a very smooth, soft, fat body. I am not a bear, right? Bears have like a hard fat, a muscular, masculine fat. Um, and so that I also see that in this film, which is why I think why I have questions about his relationship with his um partner also. Or I just have like, I'm just
His
interested.
thin partner, yeah.
Yeah. Um but yeah, definitely the way that his I don't know, his body is meant to indicate his lack of control and virility and masculinity, because men also don't have feelings, right? And so like even if he were even if you have a loved one die, you push through it and you keep showing up to work, and you don't slip into depression. And if you're gonna have disordered eating, it better fucking get you a gym body,
It
right?
better be the right one. Yeah.
Yeah. And so all that feels very wrapped up into Charlie's depiction.
Absolutely. It's so well said. And I think we've given this movie all that it deserves.
Yeah.
And I think I've said everything I need to say about it.
Yeah. I don't know that there's anything more to say. I'm disappointed but not surprised at the praise that it's getting.
Yeah. I'm not surprised, but there will be the brave few like us that are like, what the hell is this?
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, the establishment is so stupid. I mean, they're like, I think it's one of those Hollywood things of like, Roxane Gay said this, where she was basically saying there's a trend in Hollywood of like people getting awards and praise for being ugly and using all these prosthetics because it's like this ironic subversion of how they're famous because they're beautiful.
Yeah.
So this is very, like Nicole Kidman in The Hours, or anyone that's ever had a prosthetic or like played a cognitively delayed person.
It reminded me of Charlize Theron in Monster, right? In terms of like putting on a fat suit and playing gay, like getting an award. There you go.
Yeah, exactly. It's considered a very edgy career move, but
Yeah.
it's so the opposite of edgy because it's like obvious Oscar bait to me at this
Yeah.
point, where it's like there's something just inherently funny about like taking this perfectly primed and polished person and being like, this is just one of you fat sacks of shit in the audience, just an average Joe. And it's like, but we know it's not.
All it does is just push the art that is actually made by fat queer people
Mm-hmm.
further to the margins as like uninteresting, or not even worth seeing. I mean, I talk about all the time about my own journey to being a performer was moving through the internalized fat phobia that told me that like my body was not worth being seen on stage, that like people did not want to see my body on stage or bodies like mine, right? And having to work through that experience, and I think that films like this just reiterate them, um in this really sad way.
Yeah, I felt actively bad about myself after we watched this.
Yeah.
Like, it was an experience that has not left me. Um, and not because I look like Charlie or my life is similar to his. It's more, I was just like, wow, okay, this is how people see us, huh?
Right.
Like, yet again, like, okay. Like, the unflinching cruelty of the thin gaze.
Yeah. Yeah, and also just, like, it felt like an exercise in for me and, like, how far I've come in, um, working through my internalized fat phobia and having compassion for myself, right? Like, there are all these moments where, like, he uses mobility aids in the film, and like for me I'm like, oh, that's great, like I'm so glad he has that, but it's presented in the film as such, as pathetic and like, um
But that's like the ableist gaze, right? It's this idea that like if you use a cane or a walker or a wheelchair, like it's a loss of freedom, when actually to disabled people it's a symbol of freedom. Like
yeah.
it's autonomy. So it's just such a like stunted ableist fat phobic view.
Yeah, and I my worry is that it's going to reify these ideas for both thin people as well as fat people who aren't in this space where they have fat community and have, been able to see different orientations to having a fat and disabled body, right? And ways that we, deserve care and tenderness and softness, for our body's needs, and that we're not only to blame for our body, that there's like a vast complexity that is going on. And in this film, the only thing that his body and disability are, offered is shame and judgment and anger and hatred.
Yeah, and this idea of like how fat people don't feel pain
Oh
like
my God.
everybody else. You know, he says at one, she's like, I'm gonna stab you. And he's like, go ahead, my internal organs are 2 feet in. And that got like a hearty laugh from the
Yeah.
audience. And I'm like, that's not true.
No.
Like that's not how bodies work. And even still, like you can still bleed to death.
Yeah,
Like
it would still hurt.
yeah, exactly. I was like, this is so like what skinny people think
Yeah.
being fat is like. And you know, the reason I think these things are important is because it plays out in real life. Like medical professionals literally are, it is proven that they are rougher with fat patients and with Black patients because they think that we don't feel pain the same way as they do. So it's, yeah, I mean, fat has nerve endings in it. Like it's
Yeah.
connected to the rest of your body. So it was just like, and then the anatomy being so bizarre. I was like, have you guys ever met a fat person?
Yeah. And then there's, this comment very early on where his nurse friend is like, go to the hospital. And he's like, no, I don't want to go to the hospital. And there's no consideration about why this person
Right.
might not, because he knows that he's only going to be further abused at the hospital, that they are not going to help him in
Right.
any meaningful way.
Whereas like you and I watching it are like immediately we know why he's not going to the hospital.
Right.
But they don't say it out
No.
loud, so it just kind of comes off like he's stubborn and like wants to die instead
Yeah.
of like doesn't want to be abused any further.
Instead of that, he's actually actively being killed by the medical industrial complex by denying him care,
Yes.
which is what happens so often to fat people.
Right, and it's very victim blaming. It's
Yeah.
like, oh, it's up to him to make these changes, but he won't go. And it's like just very oof.
Because he's so dumb and stubborn, and you can tell that because he's so fat and disgusting.
Right, exactly. Yeah, it's just more of the same bullshit. So, with that said, Caleb, thank you so much for exercising this movie from my psyche with me. I appreciate you so
Annie.
much.
I appreciate you so much. I've been looking, I mean, we've been planning this for a while, and it's been on my mind and heart for a long time. So I'm really, really looking forward to releasing it with this conversation.
Yeah, next time Caleb's going to come back and we're going to talk about a good movie.
Hell yeah.
Yeah, we're probably going to talk about Hairspray. And I think that would be a really, really good one for a main episode to do like a beat by beat dissection. So
Yeah, I'm so excited.
Caleb, where can people find you on social media if you want them to?
Thank you for asking. You can find me on Twitter and Instagram at Dr. _chairbreaker. Yeah, and then my website is caleb-luna.com.
The best handle ever, Chairbreaker. Just
Thank you.
search Chairbreaker and Caleb will come up. And you know where to find me. Girls Guts Giallo on Instagram. Girls Guts Giallo X on Twitter. Sign up for my Patreon. It's how I make all of my money. That's how I can do this. I need help. I mean, I have a lot of help. I have great patrons. But please sign up for my Patreon. Patreon.com/girlsgutsgiallo. I have so many benefits. I'm extremely consistent. I update it like every week. So see me there. And thank you for listening.